All right, ditch the smartphone and get those brain cells firing, because we're going deep into primitive technology today. Using this stack of articles and guides you sent, we've got it all. Science of fire, practical tips on crafting spears, building shelters, even a peek into working with wood, bone, and stone.
Fascinating mix. Really makes you think. If you were dropped in the wilderness, nothing but your wits, what you could find, could you actually make this stuff? And more importantly, why would you want to?
Okay, I'll admit, when I saw fire making in your sources, I had this vision, right? Me dramatically rubbing sticks together, some ancient mystic vibe. When he even mentioned a fire crafter program, sounded so primal, almost, well, magical.
It does have that allure, doesn't it? But like most magic, there's a lot of science behind it. The fire triangle, oxygen, fuel, heat, you've probably heard of it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's not just friction, though. It's got to be enough concentrated heat to actually get that fuel going, like our modern lighters. Yeah. Still friction, but with a little chemical help.
So kindling is like giving the fire that extra push.
Exactly. It's about hitting that crucial ignition point. And speaking of crucial points, that academic article on fire by friction goes deep into the physics.
Lay it on me.
Well, with a bow drill, you're basically converting kinetic energy, the energy of motion, into thermal energy, heat.
Okay.
And that's where the spindle shape matters.
Not just any old stick will do.
Nope. How that spindle's shaped affects how well it concentrates the heat from friction. A smaller one, it might take more effort to spin, but it focuses that heat better. Faster ember formation, finesse over brute force. Maybe a good metaphor for a lot of primitive tech.
That's interesting, that like when you use a magnifying glass to focus sunlight, start a fire. Same idea, different method.
Exactly. It's knowing how forces and materials play together to get the result you want. Speaking of tools and results, classic one, the spear.
I'll confess, at first I thought, sharpened stick, done. How hard could it be?
But those survival guides, they show there's nuance to spear crafting. Ideal length depends. Throwing, stabbing, even defense.
So not just pointy end goes in the bad guy.
Nope. Balance, shaft weight, crucial. Not just about the tip, it's how the whole spear moves. Through the air or hitting its target.
Thinking survival scenario here. Spear for a rabbit versus, say, a wild boar. Pretty different.
Exactly. We even saw some spearheads, specifically for piercing armor, making bigger wounds. Not exactly light reading, but it shows how these tools were used. Hunting and fighting.
Okay, fire. Check. Spear. Check. Feeling more prepared for the wilderness already. But those sources go deep on types of wood, bone, stone. I was getting a little overwhelmed.
A lot to take in. Let's break it down.
Please, organization would be great right now.
All right, wood first. They highlight density, durability. Crucial for shafts, handles. Some wood's just better for certain jobs.
Knowing your trees is going to be a huge advantage out there, not just any branch.
Absolutely. And not just strength. One source, olive wood, prized for knife handles. Beautiful veining. Adds artistry, even in a survival setting. The pictures you gave, easy to see why they loved it.
You're right, the veining is striking. Like each handle has its own fingerprint. Makes you think, those ancient makers, did they feel pride, creating something both beautiful and useful?
Good point. Even in survival, we want to create things that are pleasing, not just practical. And that leads us to bone. Versatile stuff.
I thought, bone knife, that's it.
Misconception. Needles, awls for leather, fish hooks. Possibilities are huge. One source even said bone carving skills. Could have been valuable for bartering. Like today, a unique skill set gives you an edge.
So even back then, it was about who you know and what you can do.
Exactly. Skills are currency, always. And finally, stone. Flint knapping. Shaping it into tools.
That one always seemed the most mysterious. Just how did they do that?
Complex skill. Sources emphasize not all stone works. You need flint, obsidian, chert. Those aren't everywhere. The maps you included, it's clear they had to travel, be resourceful to find the right stuff.
And just chip at any rock and get a spear point.
Exactly. And here's another layer. Heat treating.
Wait, you heat treat stone? What does that even do?
Pretty remarkable. Heating it in a controlled way changes the properties. More brittle, easier to flake. Another example of using fire to manipulate stuff. Improve tech. Seems counterintuitive, right? Heat usually makes things stronger. But here, it makes it more workable.
Wow, I had no idea. Looking at these descriptions, it's amazing what they did with such basic tools.
It is, not without risk, though. One source mentions silicosis, a hazard for flint knappers. Lung disease from silica dust. Flint knapping makes a lot of that. Even with primitive tech, safety mattered.
Good reminder. Knowledge is power. Understanding the risks of anything is crucial, even surviving.
Exactly. Speaking of knowledge, let's move past the practical. Let's talk about the human side of crafting. It's a journey.
Looking through these sources, that's what struck me. It's not just the end product, it's the whole process.
Exactly. That knife handle guide, it highlights this. The pride in craftsmanship, self-sufficiency, creating something with your own two hands.
It's taking raw materials and shaping them into something both useful and beautiful. It's a sense of accomplishment, a connection to the materials you just don't get with factory-made stuff.
Absolutely. And it's not just the end product, the meditative side of things, scraping bone, flint knapping. It takes focus, patience, connection to the material.
Almost feel connected to our ancestors, They relied on this to survive. Picture them around a fire, shaping a spear point or a knife, lost in the rhythm of their work.
Exactly. Tangible link to our history, ingenuity and resilience. It's in us all. And that leads to a question for you to ponder.
Ooh, I love a good brain teaser. Hit me.
If you had to choose just one skill for survival, fire making, spear crafting, or flint knapping, which one and why?
Wow, that's a tough one. Really makes you think about the importance of each skill, how they'd help you survive in the wild. I don't know the answer right now, but I'll definitely be thinking about it.
As you should. Careful reflection is how we internalize knowledge. Make it ours.
Welcome back to our deep dive. I'm still thinking of that question. Which one skill would I choose?
It really gets you thinking. Not just about how cool a tool is, but how much it matters.
Totally. But before we get lost in the wilderness, those spear designs, I was struck by the variety. It's not just a pointy stick.
You got it. Remember, these tools, developed over generations, trial and error, observing nature, understanding what worked.
Something called the framea caught my eye. I never heard that term before.
The framea. Seems it was a spear used by Germanic tribes. Longer head than others, for thrusting and throwing.
A multi-purpose weapon. Makes sense. In a fight, you wouldn't want to keep switching spears.
Versatility is key. And the frame's design shows something else. Thinking about your target. A spear for hunting small game. Way different from one for, say, a charging enemy.
Right. Some even mention spearheads for piercing armor. Not a nice thought, but it makes sense for war. Makes you wonder, was there a prehistoric arms race? Weapons and armor evolving like we see today.
Now that's a thought. Shows these tools weren't just about survival. They were tied to power, too. In hunting and conflict.
Speaking of power, attaching spearheads to shafts. I thought, just tie it on tight, right? But those sources describe some pretty complex ways to do it.
Definitely different methods, each with pros and cons, depending on the materials, what the spear was for. One source, grommet mounting, sounded strong.
Grommet mounting? Sounds like something you do for curtains. What's that involve?
Basically, the shaft goes into a socket on the spearhead. Then a rivet goes through both to hold it. Prehistoric bolt and nut.
It's got to be sturdy. You wouldn't want your spearhead flying off mid-hunt. Or mid-anything, really.
Exactly. It shows how important it was, understanding different materials, working with them, even with limited tools.
Right. You can't just hammer any metal into a spearhead. You'd need to know about metals, how to shape them, whole skill set.
Absolutely. And speaking of skills, I was drawn to the knife making. All the different handle materials.
Me too. The thought and care, amazing. Back then, a good knife was everything.
It makes you appreciate the craftsmanship. And they didn't just talk practicality, it was aesthetic too. Beautiful materials, different woods, horn, even mammoth ivory.
Mammoth ivory. That's wild. To think they were using stuff from creatures that were already extinct puts things in perspective.
It does. Speaks to that long relationship. Humans and nature. We've been adapting, innovating forever.
So besides using cool extinct animal parts, what else mattered for knife handles?
Well, like spear shafts, durability, but also grip, comfort, and like we said, looks.
Even back then, looks mattered. I thought it was all about being practical.
You'd be surprised. One source specifically mentioned olive wood. How beautiful the veining is. Knife makers loved it. That human desire for beauty to make something both useful and nice to look at, it seems pretty universal.
That's so cool. I can almost picture it. The pride they felt, holding a beautiful knife they made themselves.
I think you're right. Not so different from the DIY stuff today. People want handmade to learn old skills, that satisfaction of making something yourself.
It's funny you mention that. Maybe it is a reaction to our mass-produced world. People want something unique, personal, something connected to how it was made.
Maybe it's both. That longing for the tangible. And maybe a yearning for the past. When self-sufficiency wasn't a hobby, it was life.
Whatever it is, crafting has that timeless appeal. across cultures, time.
You're right. And one source really showed that, talking about bone carving all over the world. It wasn't just practical, it was art, expressing creativity, connecting to your heritage.
It's amazing how bone, a simple thing, becomes so many things. Tools, weapons, jewelry, religious stuff. It goes on.
Shows how ingenious we are, adaptable. And that resourcefulness, it was key. Bone was strong, versatile, you wouldn't waste it.
You're making me think survival again. You'd see everything as a resource, right? Not just bone. Wood, stone, plants, anything that could help.
Exactly. Seeing the potential in everything. And that's the heart of primitive technology. Understanding nature, respecting it, working with it.
Not dominating it, but working together.
Exactly. And it's more than just surviving, it's thriving. Remember that source, Bone Tools for Bartering, shows even then, skills mattered. They could help you in your community.
Right. Trade your skills for other stuff. Creates this network, everyone depending on each other. We're social creatures. Even in tough times, we find ways to connect, cooperate.
Crucial point. These skills, they weren't just individual, shared across generations, ensuring everyone survived. Imagine those stories, the techniques, the knowledge, shared around those fires.
It wasn't just about you surviving. It was the whole community, their wisdom, their resilience. And that probably helped them get through tough times.
I think so. Sharing those experiences, relying on each other, working together. That's what builds real resilience. And those personal stories from the Knife Handle Guide, they show that. The pride, the accomplishment, making something with your own hands. Sharing that creation makes it even better.
So it's not just the tools, it's what they represent. The connections, the stories, the traditions.
Well said. And that leads us to stone. We touched on flint knapping, but there's a lot more in your sources.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's get into it. I'm ready for some ancient stoneworking secrets.
One source, a Wikipedia article on stone tools. It goes deep. The types of stone, the techniques, it even talks about industries, different ways they made and used tools, almost like schools of thought within flint knapping.
So like some specialized in arrowheads, others hand axes, scrapers, each with their own techniques.
Exactly. Each industry was like its own knowledge base, skills passed down, like a cultural fingerprint. You could tell where someone was from based on their tools.
Incredible. And the article mentioned Mode 1 to Mode 5, each one more complex. Even in the Stone Age, tech was always improving.
Absolutely. And not just sharper, tougher tools. It was about doing things better, using resources wisely.
Makes sense. You rely on stone, you wouldn't waste it. A good flint napper, they'd be valuable.
Imagine being that person, taking a rock, turning it into a tool, hunting, building, creating. They would have been revered.
The master craftspeople of their time. And what's amazing, they didn't just make tools, weapons, they made art too. One source, flint-napped pendants, figurines.
Yeah.
Beautiful and useful.
Isn't that fascinating? We want to be creative no matter what. Art is a part of us. Doesn't matter the time period or the tools.
It's so inspiring. And those flint napping techniques, it's not just hitting rocks. You got to understand the material, be delicate, patient.
One source talked about this, how a skilled flint napper would study the stone, looking for flaws, seeing how it would break, like they could read the stone.
And use that knowledge to shape it, like a sculptor with clay.
Exactly. It shows human ingenuity, how we use nature to meet our needs.
And speaking of using nature, you mentioned heat treating. How they use heat to make the stone better.
It's clever. They'd carefully heat it, just the right temperature. That changed the stone, made it easier to flake.
Like a prep step. Made flint napping more efficient. Like using fire to control what the stone was like.
You got it. Another example, understanding natural processes to improve their tech. It's humbling, their knowledge, and how limited their tools were.
Makes you realize what we take for granted. We have all this advanced stuff, but do we really get it? Do we have that same connection to the materials?
Great question. It brings up something big in these sources. All these skills, they needed a connection to nature. A level of awareness we've kind of lost.
True. We're so disconnected from where things come from. Food, clothes, shelter, it's just there. But back then, you had to understand nature to survive.
It's like primitive technology wasn't just skills, it was a whole way of life, how you saw the world, curiosity, respect, learning from nature.
And maybe gratitude, too. Imagine making fire, or a tool to feed your family, using only what you know.
Empowering. You know, it's interesting. Life was harder then, but maybe richer in some ways.
Richer? How so?
Well, imagine your survival depending on you. You can't just buy what you need, you got to create it. It'd be tough. But there's satisfaction in knowing you can provide for yourself.
And that connection to the world. Understanding how things work. It's not just taking, it's giving back. being a part of it all.
Well said. And that connection, it's what people are looking for today. That's why we see primitive skills, rewilding, permaculture. It's a longing to go back to our roots, rediscover those lost ways of being.
And maybe find a purpose, a belonging that's missing now. It's not just surviving, it's finding your place in the world.
Powerful thought. And it shows, even though our tech is advanced, we can still learn from the past. The wisdom and resilience of our ancestors.
You know, I get why you asked about choosing one skill. It makes us face how much we rely on modern stuff. Think about what we really need, not just in the wilderness, but in life.
Exactly. And there's no easy answer. It's about discovering yourself, exploring, connecting with our instincts, the potential that's inside all of us.
Well, listeners, this has been amazing. These sources have opened my eyes. Primitive technology, it's not just the past, it's the present and the future.
I agree. And it's more than just how to do stuff. It's a way of thinking, of being, connecting with the world and with ourselves.
We're going to take a short break, but join us for the last part of this deep dive. We'll explore even more and maybe finally answer that big question. Which skill would we choose? Back again for the deep dive. What a journey this has been. Fire, spears, knives, bone carving. We've been all over. But there's so much more in these sources you gave us.
It's true. We've only just started. And I noticed they don't just focus on the tools, the typical primitive stuff. They talk about things you might not think of as essential, like musical instruments.
Musical instruments. I always thought of those as a luxury. Not exactly top priority when you're trying to survive out there.
Makes sense to think that way. But even in the toughest situations, humans, we need to express ourselves, connect, find beauty. Music can be powerful for that.
True. It's not just the body surviving, it's the mind and spirit too. I can see how music would help. Keep people's spirits up, create community, even a way to process things, what they're going through.
Exactly. And that source you gave about musical instruments, it shows how even simple things, bone flutes, can make such complex sounds.
So it wasn't just knives and needles. Bone was the original rock and roll. Love it.
Adds a whole new layer to how we see primitive life. They weren't just focused on staying alive. They wanted beauty, joy, connection.
Beautiful thought. Makes you wonder, what other things that we see as extra were actually important to them? Things we haven't even thought of. Changes how we see what a good life is, you know?
I think you're right. Studying the past, seeing how people lived, it can teach us so much. Helps us rethink what's important to us, what really matters.
Okay, ready for more perspective shifts. But before we get too deep, a practical thing we haven't talked about much. Shelter.
Ah, yes. Shelter. Can't live without it. Your sources talk about all sorts of options. Simple lean-tos, more complex stuff like grass huts. Fascinating how they adapted what they built to the environment.
One even talked about caves. Makes sense. A ready-made shelter, why not use it?
Absolutely. It's all about working with nature, observing, being creative. Of course, even a cave needs some work. You can't just move in.
So even a natural shelter, you still need those primitive tech skills. To adapt, improve it. It's all about understanding the materials, how to use them.
Exactly. And same with a grass hut. Got to know the right grasses, how to weave them for a good roof, reinforce it with branches, vines. It's a whole other skill set.
Sounds like a lot of work. But I bet finishing a shelter you built yourself must feel incredible, like your own little safe haven, in a world that can be pretty rough.
Powerful feeling for sure. Something we've lost touch with. We have our needs met, a roof over our heads. We forget the effort that goes into it.
You're right. We take it for granted. But knowing how to build from scratch, just using natural materials, it makes you appreciate our ancestors, their cleverness, their skill.
It does. And it shows, even in tough times, you can create something good, comfortable, useful. With just your own hands, it's about resourcefulness, resilience, that connection to nature we keep talking about.
You know, I'm seeing primitive technology as more than just skills. It's like a philosophy. Approaching the world with curiosity, creativity, trying things out. It's about embracing the unknown, finding beauty and ingenuity in simple things.
That's a great way to put it. It's about moving past fear, embracing the challenges, knowing you can create, adapt, thrive, even when things are hard.
And maybe even find some joy in it. Mastering a skill, working with your hands, making something beautiful and useful from nature. Like tapping into something deep inside us, something we've forgotten.
I couldn't agree more. It's rediscovering those instincts, those old skills we all have, connecting with our roots, with nature, with ourselves.
Well, listeners, what a trip this has been. Primitive technology, from fire to shelter. We've seen the science, the designs, the artistry, even touched on what it means to be human.
And we've seen how these skills, they can teach us about being resourceful, resilient, about connecting with nature, each other, ourselves.
So as we wrap up, one last thought. Which primitive skill would you choose? And how can you use what we've talked about today to face your challenges with that same ingenuity, creativity, resilience? Keep exploring, keep learning, keep that fire burning.